Air conditioning. Well, welcome back. We are here for the final panel, not the final event, but the final panel of our conference, Nietzsche's Critique of Religion. We will be hearing from Alexander Duff, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of North Texas. Also our own director of the LeFrak Forum, Dustin Sebell, who is also Associate Professor of Political Science at Michigan State University, and Senior Research Fellow at the U.S. Naval Academy's Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. Discussing their papers will be Peter Arnsdorf, who again is the James B. Duke Professor of Political Science and Affiliated Professor of Classics at Davidson College. I will leave it to them.
It is customary to begin with expressions of thanks, I've noticed over the last few days. I have more than most to give, I think. First of all, for the invitation. I was invited by Dustin to give a talk on Nietzsche at a distinguished assembly of Nietzsche scholars, and I said, Dustin, it's impossible. I'm not a Nietzsche scholar. Some of us have said this, but it's really true of me. I'm not. It's impossible. I absolutely cannot do it. And he said, there's some money involved. And I said, I might have something. Second of all, to the organizers, Zach, Rachel, this has been wonderful. I'm looking forward to the rest of it, but so far it's been great. Third, to my gracious interlocutor here, Dr. Arnsdorf, he received a paper not 48 hours ago, and I took the liberty of insisting that he needn't prepare any remarks, but I think he has, something quite good to say. I won't raise the bar too much, but any defects are mine, I insist. And then fourth, to you, my other interlocutors, I'm going to conclude with some questions. As I said, I'm not a Nietzsche scholar, but I'm in the company of them, and I have some questions. So I'll lead up to those. The title of my talk is Heidegger on Nietzsche and Nihilism. Both Nietzsche and Heidegger are often described as nihilistic thinkers. This is a go-to among a certain sort of Christian or moralistic critic. The great George Grant, for instance, often paired them with a hyphen, Nietzsche-Heidegger. And despite that, one would have to say he ultimately learned a great deal from them as diagnosticians of the mass age. He nonetheless trafficked in a rather plain critique of them as propounding a form of nihilism. However, as everyone here already knows, each of Nietzsche and Heidegger wished not merely to propose a nihilistic position, but rather made the problem of nihilism thematic to their own analysis and diagnosis of what went wrong in the tradition of Western philosophy and politics. In short, Western civilization. On a long enough timeline, perhaps, every critic of nihilism will eventually be criticized as nihilistic. This is what happened to Nietzsche with respect to Heidegger. What I propose today is to explore Heidegger's critique of Nietzsche on precisely the issue of Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism, which Heidegger finds both illuminating and sufficiently erroneous to be itself nihilistic. In my view, as I hope to elaborate, Heidegger's differences from Nietzsche reveal a fascinating avenue into understanding enduring differences between them. The nature of Heidegger's criticism distances himself from what I might call the aesthetic or moral dimension, which Nietzsche sees as so much the essence of the problem of nihilism, and thus prepares or shows Heidegger's peculiar vulnerability to gross political miscalculation, not to say wicked, execrable political judgment. To expand by way of contrast, I am more accustomed to making this point with respect to Heidegger and the Greek political philosophers, that he is blind to political phenomena. When making that point, I'm repeating something I learned especially from Richard Velkley, who captures this very nicely in the title of a book chapter, Freedom from the Good, in a discussion of Heidegger. But the point can be made somewhat differently from the perspective of Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche, I've discovered. Nietzsche's sometimes outrageous but always penetrating moral sensitivity, oft formulated in the matrix of aesthetics, emerges in sharp distinction from what might be called the moral oblivion of Heidegger's position. A word on the different political legacies of each, stated with some exaggeration, I hope you'll forgive me, for the purposes of making a contrast. Heidegger's abstraction from the moral issues, driven as I shall show by the nature of his analysis of metaphysics and nihilism, will allow him to be rather wantonly repurposed for political projects of different stripes, let me say crudely and non-exhaustively, of the left, not only of the right. To be sure, this often requires fastening to him an activist political apparatus, be it Gramscian, Marxist, what have you, somewhat at odds with his characteristic posture of Gelassenheit. But as I say, the radical abstraction from moral phenomena permits of this. Nietzsche, on the other hand, can, yes, be repurposed, as can all great thinkers to whom one can do violence. I'm acquainted with scholars who consider Nietzsche a feminist, for example. And what is more, the deconstructive or skeptical dimensions of Nietzsche, as also with Heidegger, invite something of this. Nonetheless, Nietzsche's refined moral sense makes his appropriation by the political gutter require that they do somewhat more violence to his work than the radical moral abstraction, not to say oblivion, characteristic of Heidegger. As I said, that was an exaggeration, but I hope it's helpful. My talk today is drawn principally from the essay Nietzsche's Word, God is Dead, which was published in Holzwege in 1950, and the essay Nihilism as Determined by the History of Being, which was published in 1961 as in the second of the two Nietzsche volumes. Heidegger attends to Nietzsche as one who both experienced an age of nihilism and diagnosed it. But he ultimately argues that Nietzsche's analysis was insufficiently profound to liberate himself from the condition, and thus that Nietzsche remained nihilistic. This is how he concludes the essay, Nietzsche's Word, God is Dead. Nietzsche indeed came to know, in the age in which nihilism was beginning to be completed, some of the traits of nihilism. But at the same time, he interpreted them nihilistically, thereby completely burying their essence. Nietzsche never recognized the essence of nihilism like every other metaphysics before him. By nihilism, Nietzsche, and Heidegger with him, refers to the collapse of the realm of the supersensory, übersinnlich. The ordering principles distinguished from what may be apprehended strictly with the material senses, leaving behind only what had been the sensory. But without its ordering principles governing its apprehension, the sensory is no longer really the sensory. And the whole world, Heidegger glosses, loses its sense. The sensory without the supersensory is senseless, sinnlosen. That is bereft of meaning. This is what is captured in the, I will say, infamous phrase, the death of God, attributed by Nietzsche to a madman in an aphorism of the Gay Science. It would be fair to ask what Heidegger and we, his readers, expect to accomplish through this critical reading of Nietzsche. Heidegger describes his effort as a preparatory thinking, which anticipates but does not itself execute a, quote, simple and inconspicuous step forward in thought, end quote, which he illustrates with metaphors of sowing and plowing. Preparatory thinking is like plowing, even before sowing. What will be the harvest of such thought? Might we be in a position yet to say? Preparatory thinking is also, Heidegger elaborates, to be distinguished from the sciences, which are the offspring of metaphysics. Heidegger's reading and thinking, then, is non-metaphysical. This sticks out because of his strange and recurring insistence that Nietzsche's thought is metaphysical, that Nietzsche offers a metaphysics of value, and so forth. Heidegger, as he understands himself here, is not doing that. I quote again. To think preparatorily and to fulfill such thinking involves an education in thinking in the midst of the sciences, to go past them without despising them, end quote. Why would we need or want to go past the metaphysical sciences? Heidegger's answer points to what he here calls the experience out of which his masterpiece of some 2 decades prior had been thought, namely, the obscurity caused by the scientific attention to the beings in order to inquire about being. He writes, this thinking has been concerned constantly with one occurrence, event, Ereignis, that in the history of Western thinking, right from the beginning, beings have been thought in regard to being, but the truth of being has remained unthought. Indeed, not only has the truth of being been denied to thinking as a possible experience, but Western thinking itself, precisely in the form of metaphysics, has specifically, though unknowingly, masked the occurrence of this denial, end quote. Such passage over being, as Heidegger develops the thought, especially in the essay Nihilism as Determined by the History of Being, is the essence of nihilism, itself overlooked by Nietzsche. Nietzsche's interpretation of the historical phenomena of nihilism is concentrated into the brief phrase, God is dead. Heidegger is at some pains to dispense with the mistaken view that Nietzsche, the atheist, is expressing a dismissive view of the Christian religion. Heidegger proposes alternatively, in an important echo or allusion to the title of his essay, that it must still be asked whether Nietzsche, if anything, is rather not expressing here the word that has always been implicitly spoken within the metaphysically determined history of the West. The reference God indicates not only the Christian God, but the entire supersensory apparatus of the Western metaphysical tradition, sweeping in thinkers from Plato to Kant, subsuming them within a matrix that distinguishes the true and actually real world, a mountain of eternal bliss, from the this-worldly vale of tears. To say that God is dead is to announce the powerlessness of the supersensory, the life-draining result of Platonism. In this context, Nietzsche understands himself as the counter-movement to Platonism. The pretension to be the counter-Plato, as we shall see, is a crucial element in Heidegger's critique of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's determination to reply to counter-Plato and metaphysical Platonism ensnares him and his thought in an inescapable relationship to this antagonist. To wit, I quote again, since all it does is turn metaphysics upside down, Nietzsche's counter-movement against metaphysics remains embroiled in it and has no way out. In fact, it is embroiled in it to such a degree that it is sealed off from its essence and, as metaphysics, is unable ever to think its own essence. Heidegger elucidates the connection between nihilism, so-called, and the death of God by fastening onto a briefly stated question from the famous passage in The Gay Science. The passage is, "Aren't we astray in an endless nothing?" Nietzsche writes. That is, with the demise of all supersensible ordering principles, with their erosion or evaporation, all binding claims and standards have released their grip. Nothing no longer compels or exhorts with meaning. This higher world is, quote, bereft of its binding and above all its inspiring or constructive power, end quote. In Nietzsche's presentation, according to Heidegger, the nothing obtrudes with the collapse of higher ordering principles. Life is then haunted by the eeriest, unheimlichste of all guests. Moreover, it is developing historically that is in tandem with the spread of the principles of the West. I quote again, hence nihilism is not just one historical phenomena among others, not just one spiritual intellectual current that occurs within Western history after others have occurred, after Christianity, after humanism, and after the Enlightenment. On the contrary, it is fundamental to the movement of the West itself. This is Heidegger. Nihilism has played itself out historically in a familiar pattern, but allow me to rehearse the key elements as the pattern itself becomes important to Heidegger's critique. The formula God is dead, as we have seen, implicates not simply the Christian God narrowly, thus referencing the ascent of atheistic unbelief, but of the supersensory goals which command orienting allegiance. So God's authority within the church may wane as that of conscience waxes, then to be replaced by the authority of reason, and then again by social instinct. This is parallel to the development, the withdrawal from the world into the supersensory has been replaced with a commitment to historical progress. The goal of eternal bliss in the hereafter is transformed into the greatest happiness of the greatest number. The care for the cultus of religion was replaced with enthusiasm for the spread of Kultur or civilization. The key here is that the place of the Christian ecclesiastical and theological interpretation of the world, a certain hierarchical order of beings, the shape of which is derived from the Hellenistic Judaic world and whose fundamental structure was established through Plato at the outset of Western metaphysics, that shape and that place has been retained, while its occupant changes. Heidegger refers to the apprehending structure of beings in its entirety as metaphysics, differentiated into the supersensory and the sensory worlds, the former of which supports and determines the latter, and it encompasses the historical sweep from ideas to God, the moral law, the authority of reason, progress, the happiness of the greatest number, of culture and civilization. Amidst this historically unfolding destiny, the supersensory meets its ruin Thus, manifold forms of unbelief are not nihilism, strictly speaking, but they are the consequences of nihilism. Indeed, Heidegger at multiple points stresses that Christianity itself is a consequence and form of nihilism. Nietzsche's definition of nihilism. Heidegger appears to regard it as avoiding the error of confusing the phenomena of nihilism, such as technology or the revolt of the masses, for nihilism itself. Nietzsche's definition of nihilism is that the highest values devalue themselves. Key term here is values. That is, Nietzsche locates the meaning of the spread of the nothing and its erasure, of the governance of the supersensory, to the devaluation of the highest values. The reply to the devaluation of the highest values proposed and then affirmed by Nietzsche is, famously, the revaluation of the highest values, i.e., the replacement of what are ultimately revealed to be life-denying values with life-affirming values, saying yes to the latter and an absolute uncompromising no to the former, as Heidegger will unfold it in his analysis. This attention to values does not allow Nietzsche or us to overcome nihilism, but remains trapped within the framework of nihilism. To restate then, with maximum brevity, Nietzsche regards nihilism as about values and the deterioration of values. The movement of God from conscience to reason to social instinct is a movement from orientation by one value to another. As Heidegger elaborates, both the ruination of values, the decline, but then also the prospect of the final revaluation of values heralded by Nietzsche, are each moments in the general historical movement of nihilism. I quote again, in Nietzsche's interpretation of nihilism is always a history dealing with values, dispensing with values, revaluing values, with dispensing values anew, and ultimately actually with the differently valuing establishment of the principle behind every dispensation of values. A great deal, Heidegger then indicates, will depend on what Nietzsche means by value. What is more, I would say, a great deal depends on Heidegger's analysis and critique of what Nietzsche means by value. Because it is by means of Heidegger's interpretation of what Nietzsche means by value, and thereby of what a revaluation of all values entails, that Heidegger is warranted in saying that Nietzsche remains a metaphysician, in his case, a metaphysician of value, and thereby trapped by nihilism. That's the structure of Heidegger's argument. The text Heidegger takes as revealing the meaning for Nietzsche of value is the following, from a note written in 1887 and 88, there-ish. Quote, the viewpoint of value is the viewpoint of the conditions for preservation increase in regard to the complex structures, relatively enduring, of life in the midst of becoming. Heidegger takes from this passage the crucial distinctive emphasis on viewpoint and develops this to provide the key to understanding what Nietzsche means by value, and indeed why he remains a metaphysician. To value in Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche is, these are my terms, to eyeball, to spy, to escry, a thing, and to count it, that's his term. To count it, we might say, to reckon it. I quote Heidegger. Value is the point of sight for a seeing that has its eye on something, or as we say, that counts on, auf etwas rechnet, something and thereby has to deal with something else. End quote. It is a seeing which relates one something quantitatively to another something. How so? The seeing of valuing always references, as it were at a glance, both the thing being seen or being evaluated with reference to a prior thing seen, the scale against which it is being reckoned. Heidegger refers to this seeing, which recalls a prior seeing, as representing. Indeed, quote, it is only through this setting with representation that the point which is necessary for keeping an eye on something and which therefore directs the visual course of this seeing becomes a point of sight. That is, becomes what matters in seeing and in all activity directed by vision, end quote. We see here a recurrent motif from Heidegger's thought. present from his earliest courses after World War I, where he critiques the inadequacy of theoretical rationality to apprehend motion, until late into his life, which is his assimilation of his analysis and critique of metaphysics to the recurrent metaphor from the history of philosophy in the West to understanding thinking in terms of metaphors of sight and seeing, theoria, for instance. Perhaps the most famous of these is the representation in Plato of the eidos and the idea. His critique of traditional metaphors of sight is sometimes paired with a phenomenological analysis of the different senses, and in this pairing, a kind of preference on Heidegger's part for hearing rather than seeing, as revealing a dimension of being more likely to be overlooked by the optical visual emphasis. And let me add parenthetically, Heidegger does not dispense altogether with attention to sight and light. The terms Umsicht, Vorsicht, Lichten are familiar to every Heidegger scholar, but he redirects how these fit into the larger world and his analysis of thinking. Heidegger's fuller point is that seeing or thinking, as formulated by the primary figures from the history of Western thought, is inordinately determined by its attention to beings or things, to the ultimate exclusion, even forgetfulness of the distinction between the being of beings and being as such. And inasmuch as his philosophic mission is the recovery of the question of being in its long forgotten fullness, such a distinction is of vital importance. In the case of Nietzsche, the unlikeliest of metaphysicians, maybe we could say, Heidegger's claim is that the attention by the will to power to establish values according to which life may be enhanced is oriented by beings just like other forms of metaphysics. To be in the highest sense for Nietzsche is to be a value, but to be a valid value, thus to be a representation. Nietzsche's claim thus shares in the characteristic error of metaphysics, which is that in being oriented by beings, it overlooks being as such. Stated differently, it formulates an understanding of the being of the beings, which excludes a true fathoming of being, as it were, not of the beings. Nietzsche sees the path beyond nihilism as its fulfillment in the revaluation of values, which no longer replaces old values with new ones, but which instead reverses the very character and mode of valuing. It does so by no longer patching another chief value into the top spot of the dead supersensory, first God, now the conscience, now reason, but instead seeking out a different place or realm, namely, what is most alive. I'll quote. So nihilism itself turns into the ideal of the most abundant life. In this new highest value is concealed another estimation of life, i.e. of the basis of the determining essence of all living things, end quote. Heidegger's riposte is that for all its intuition of what contours the overcoming of nihilism must assume, including the necessity that such an epoch would be very much unlike any prior epoch in human history, Nietzsche's reversal of metaphysics is only a mere reversal. It is unfortunately, quote, a self-blinding entanglement in what is the same though become unrecognizable, end quote. The fatal flaw of Nietzsche's revaluation as means of surpassing nihilism is its character as valuing per se. He remains entangled in the decisive error of metaphysics, its persistent orientation by the beings in its determination of the meaning of being. A genuinely new epoch, as Heidegger will be at some pains to sketch himself, will make overtures to understanding being's own concealed self-concealment as the key to understanding being in a manner that is not merely a reversal of metaphysics, but its genuine transcendence. Such an understanding will apprehend then that from the beginning of metaphysical thinking, the truth of being itself will be passed over, forgotten as it were. Metaphysics itself thus is nihilism, and Nietzsche does not escape this. Allow me to conclude then by posing two questions for the Nietzsche scholars, both avowed and disavowed in the room. So first of all, I'll just put this, perhaps we could discuss in a few moments after Dustin's paper. Heidegger is saying in effect that he, not Nietzsche, has the better assessment of what post-metaphysical, post-historical moment looks like. Is he onto something? Is this true? Has he elaborated something that Nietzsche missed? That's number one. Number two, Everything depends on Heidegger's own rather heavy-handed analysis of what it means to value. We've heard different accounts of valuing over the last 2 days. To calculate worth, to reckon worth. And the additional claim that this passes over being. Is this a fair account of what Nietzsche even means by value, by valuing? I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.
So I wasn't actually invited. I'm filling in for Dick Zinman, who unfortunately, my friend and colleague who unfortunately couldn't be here today, at least in body. In spirit, he's here, although you might not know it. I know it because my inbox is full of emails with questions that he would like me to put to various conference participants. We're going to reserve, I think, the last question of this panel for Dick Zinman. He's going to channel through me to Michael Granke, for whom he has a question.
Last 30 minutes.
Yeah. We'll end now. It's actually especially unfortunate that Dick isn't here because as I look around the room, I realize that the mustachioed are severely underrepresented among the conference participants, and Nietzsche not only wore a beautiful mustache, but wrote beautifully about them. Dick would have remedied this problem. So anyway, I am going to offer an articulation of Nietzsche's critique of religion. As I'm sure you'll notice in the course of my articulation of Nietzsche's critique of religion, a critique of his critique will emerge. I make war on the theologian instinct. I found its trace everywhere. Whoever has theologian blood in his veins takes a crooked and dishonest stance on all things from the start. The pathos that develops out of this dubs itself faith. Eyes closed to itself once and for all so as not to suffer from the sight of incurable falseness. A morality, a virtue, a holiness are fashioned for oneself out of this flawed optics on all things. Good conscience is linked to false viewing. What a theologian perceives as true must be false. In this, we practically have a criterion of truth. It's his most fundamental self-preservation instinct that forbids reality to be honored at any point or even to get a word in edgewise. These lines taken from Antichrist 9 give expression to the least idiosyncratic, most traditional part of the equation of Nietzsche's critique of religion. The religious men, the homines religiosi, lie their way out of reality. This they do, Nietzsche adds in Antichrist 15, because they suffer from it. But what exactly is the reality out of which the religious men lie their way? And what exactly is the lie in which they seek refuge from reality? Nietzsche elaborates on the difference between what's real and what's merely imagined by the religious men in Antichrist 15, when he says that Christianity does not have any point of contact with reality. By reality here, Nietzsche seems to mean especially natural causes. Nature, he says, is the counter-concept of God, because Christianity completely lacks the concept of natural causes. In Christianity, by contrast with reality, there's nothing but imaginary causes, like God, and nothing but imaginary effects, like mercy and punishment. The traffic between imaginary causes and imaginary effects finally adds up to the anthropocentric imaginary teleology of the Last Judgment, according to which the Christian God is the imaginary cause of the imaginary effects of mercy and punishment. Nietzsche goes on in Antichrist 26 to link the anthropocentric teleological causality imagined by the religious men to what he calls the lie of a moral world order. What, he asks, does moral world order mean? It means, he replies, that once and for all there is a will of God directing what human beings may or may not do, that the value of a people or individual is to be measured according to how much or how little the will of God is obeyed, that in the destinies of a people or an individual, the will of God is shown as sovereign, that is, as punishing and rewarding according to the degree of obedience. The morally ordered world is teleological, then, insofar as God's purposes are sovereign. And it is anthropocentric, insofar as God purposes a world ordered morally, in such a way as to be responsive to human purposes. But again, according to Nietzsche, that's just a lie, in which the religious men seek refuge from reality. In reality, to quote Beyond Good and Evil 9, nature is indifferent, without purpose and consideration, without mercy and justice. For precisely this reason, however, the reality, the nature, out of which the religious men lie their way is knowable, if not exactly hospitable to human life or to humanity's hopes. While the moral world order, comforting though it may be, can only be imagined or grasped by faith. A religion like Christianity that has no point of contact with reality, Nietzsche says, must be a mortal enemy of the wisdom of the world. In other words, of science. For science, he goes on to say, is the healthy grasp of cause and effect. And the moral world order, the lie of the moral world order, means to destroy the human sense of causation. It is, Nietzsche says, an assassination attempt on the concept of cause and effect. Now, for all its hyperbole and raw emotion, neither of which, of course, is in good classical taste, the Antichrist is somehow at times Nietzsche's most traditional, least idiosyncratic late work. The Antichrist presents us with a choice between two worlds. On the one hand, there's a world in which God's purpose is sovereign, a world in which, to quote Nietzsche, the laws of nature are continually broken, so that God's will vis-a-vis human beings can be done. Knowledge or science is out of the question in that world. Knowledge or science is impossible in that world since, to quote Nietzsche again, Antichrist 55, all the supreme questions, all the supreme values are beyond human reason. And knowledge or science is not only impossible, it's undesirable in that world since, to quote Antichrist 5, the supreme values of intellectuality are sinful. In that world, then, faith is our only star and compass. On the other hand, there's a world in which nature, or the principle of causality, and not God, is sovereign. In that world, which leaves no room for an all-powerful, miracle-working God who is free to break the laws of nature as he sees fit, there are laws of nature for us to know. In that world, reason, not faith, is our only star and compass. The traditionalism of the Antichrist comes to sight particularly when you compare the fundamental alternatives as Nietzsche presents them there with the fundamental alternatives as the philosopher, according to Maimonides, saw them. According to Maimonides, the philosopher faced a choice. Either the world, he says, exists in virtue of natural necessity, or it exists in virtue of the purpose of one who purposes. But, and here's where Nietzsche and Maimonides part ways, but whereas the philosopher, according to Maimonides, saw little or no way to make a reasonable choice between the two alternatives, Nietzsche clearly did not hesitate to choose nature and science over God and faith. Nietzsche subjects the faith of the faithful to mockery. He denies that the God concealed from reason can be revealed to faith. Let us assume, he says, that faith makes blessed. Would blessedness, he asks, would blessedness, speaking more technically, pleasure, ever be a proof of truth? So little, he answers, that it practically produces the counterproof. In any case, the highest suspicion against truth. When sensations of pleasure join the conversation over the question, what is true? The proof of pleasure, he says in Antichrist 50, the proof of pleasure is a proof for pleasure, nothing more. There's just one problem here. At least, there's just one problem I'll highlight. The counter-concept of God, nature or necessity, isn't revealed to reason either. Nietzsche's faith in natural causation is by his own account just that, faith. In Beyond Good and Evil 11, to make clear the value that Kant attributed to himself, Nietzsche tacitly quotes from the preface to Kant's Prolegomena, where Kant says that his deduction of the principle of causality from pure understanding and not, as Hume feared, from mere experience, was the most difficult thing that could ever be undertaken on behalf of metaphysics. Now, Nietzsche distinguishes himself from people everywhere on the grounds that he alone does not wisely sidestep the value Kant attributed to himself, which is to say, Nietzsche did not hesitate to grant the need for a solution to the Humean problem. But while granting that the Humean problem needs a solution if philosophy or metaphysics is going to be possible, he refused to accept Kant's solution to it. In Beyond Good and Evil 4, for example, Nietzsche asserts that the synthetic judgments a priori, not least the judgment that every effect has a cause, belongs among the falsest judgments. And he goes on to say, in Beyond Good and Evil 21, that cause and effect should not be erroneously reified, as the natural scientists do. Cause and effect should only be used, he says, as conventional fictions for the purpose of communication, not of explanation. In the in itself, there is nothing, he says, of causal connections or necessity. It is we alone who have invented causes. Now, Nietzschean statements to this effect are easy to come by. In the Gay Science, for example, Nietzsche says that the principle of causality is merely an article of faith without which we could not live. And in The Dawn, he says that we merely imagine causes and effects. In fact, we have no insight into a connection more essential than that of plain succession, which I think should remind you of Hume. For Nietzsche, it's fair to say that the Humean problem is still a problem. Given then Nietzsche's grave doubts about the principle of causality, it shouldn't come as a complete surprise that while he claims in Antichrist 50 that faith proves nothing because the pleasure faith brings is proof for pleasure, nothing more, or going even further, while he claims in Antichrist 11 that just the reverse is true, that pleasure is proof of untruth, he also simultaneously claims in Antichrist 11, that an action to which one is compelled by the instinct for life has its proof of being right, a right action, by the pleasure it brings. Nietzsche wavered, to put it mildly, as to whether faith, pleasure, proves anything. Nietzsche prefaced Human All Too Human by saying that he wished to choose for himself the best way of life. Over time, he says he concluded that it was best, quote, to employ my entire life in cultivating my reason, and to advance myself as far as I could in the knowledge of the truth. But even while cultivating his reason with a highly unusual degree of seriousness and ability, doubts about the reasonability of the cultivation of reason itself continued to haunt him. For nature, which is both the subject matter and the condition of reason, was for him an article of faith, proved only, it seems, by the pleasure it brought him. My point so far is this. As regards the fundamental premise of philosophy or science, Nietzsche's dogmatism, his faith in natural causation, was contradicted by his skepticism. And his skepticism about what we can know left him in the awkward position of believing without seeing that the world exists in virtue of natural necessity and not in virtue of the purpose of one who purposes. But if Nietzsche's skepticism pulled the rug out from under his philosophical dogmatism, the philosophical dogmatism absolutely required by his theoretical critique of religion, what prevented him from suffering shipwreck, or what prevented him from realizing he'd suffered shipwreck? Following the collapse of dogmatism, which is to say, following truth's apparent success in eluding reason, Nietzsche was naturally led to question the value of the will to truth. This makes sense, for if truth eludes reason, what's the point of a life employed in cultivating reason and seeking knowledge of the truth? The philosophic life becomes questionable insofar as knowledge, the object of the philosopher's love, seems impossible to obtain. Now, despite questioning the value of the will to truth, Nietzsche never, I think, gave up on the truth entirely. At the same time, however, he said of truth or knowledge seeking that it's insane. The search for knowledge of the truth is insane, he said in Beyond Good and Evil 230, because the will to truth is ultimately a kind of spiritualized self-cruelty, and thus maybe even, as Gay Science 344 would have it, a hidden will to death. But this, the fact that it could be part of the fundamental character of existence that someone would perish from complete knowledge of the truth does not undermine the search for truth. For Nietzsche, rather, it ennobles it. It ennobles it such that the strength of a spirit, as he says, would be measured by just how much he could still endure of the truth. The will to truth is sublime, according to Nietzsche, or noble, although or because it's insane. Now, for reasons that will become clear shortly, this brings me to Beyond Good and Evil 55, where I think the deepest core, if not the whole, of Nietzsche's critique of religion comes into view. There's a great ladder of religious cruelty, he says there, with many rungs, but 3 of them are particularly important. First, he says, people sacrificed human beings to one's God, maybe even the most beloved human beings. Second, they sacrificed their strongest instincts. Nietzsche's thinking of the saint. Finally, Nietzsche says, what remained to be sacrificed? Didn't people have to ultimately sacrifice all solace, holiness, salvation, all hope, all faith in a secret harmony, in future bliss and justice? Didn't they have to sacrifice their very God and out of cruelty against themselves worship the stones, stupidity, gravity, fate, nothingness? To sacrifice God for nothingness, he says, this paradoxical mystery of ultimate cruelty was reserved for the philosophers of the future. Because Nietzsche's extravagant honesty is animated by self-cruelty, and not by a yearning to know or by hatred of the lie in the soul, his honesty rules out faith in future bliss and justice, not by virtue of a rational demonstration that the moral world order is merely imagined, not real, but by virtue of a conscientious refusal of the solace it brings. Nietzsche's deepest objection to religion is moral or practical, in other words, not theoretical. At bottom, he objects to religion because it's anti-tragic, because it lacks sublimity or nobility, not because it's false. But is this sufficient? Let me conclude with 3 closely connected reasons why I continue to doubt that it is. The first reason I gather from some statements Strauss makes in the preface to Spinoza's Critique of Religion. First, in the Gay Science 344, Nietzsche deduces the will to truth from morality, namely the moral prohibition against lying. It's not just any morality, by the way, it's Christian morality, from which he deduces the will to truth. That aphorism is entitled, How We Too Are Still Pious. Nietzsche repeats the point in the genealogy, in part 3, section 27, when quoting at length from Gay Science 357, he says, one finally sees what actually triumphed over the Christian God, Christian morality itself, the concept of truthfulness taken ever more rigorously. Christian theology is over now, he says, because it has the conscience against it. This means, as he also says in part 3, section 27, unconditional and honest atheism does not stand in contrast to the ascetic ideal. Rather, it is only one of its latest phases of development. Now, there's no need to dwell on the fact that the reasoning by which Nietzsche purports to deduce the will to truth from the moral prohibition against lying in Gay Science 344 is flawed. It is, but it suffices to note that Nietzsche rejected the effort to retain Christian morality while jettisoning the Christian God elsewhere. In The Twilight of the Idols, he says, if we give up the Christian faith, we pull the right to Christian morality from under our feet. And yet, even by his own account, Nietzsche himself retains Christian morality, understood as truthfulness or honesty, while jettisoning the Christian God. I think since God remained for Nietzsche a theoretical possibility, consistency would have required him either to give up on truthfulness or philosophy on the one hand, or I think to return to the fold. Second, in Beyond Good and Evil 39, Nietzsche says that no one would go so far as to consider a doctrine true just because it makes people happy. Happiness and virtue are not arguments. And indeed, he adds, making people unhappy and evil likewise are not counter-arguments. But if happiness and virtue are not arguments, they're not arguments for or against. The Christian morality which lives on in Nietzsche, and maybe even in Nietzsche's Superman, who he described at one point as Caesar with Christ's soul in an unpublished note, might just require him to self-flagellate to the point where he wishes to sacrifice God for nothing. What of it? The wish to sacrifice God, like the wish to love God, has no bearing whatsoever on the question of the existence of God. Whether you wish to be independent of your father's care and to fend for yourself, or whether you wish to be cared for and coddled by your father, your wishes are not facts. Your father might still be alive and well, and he might still care or not care for you all the same. This goes for God too, I think. And for this reason, the philosophers of the future will smile, Nietzsche says, if someone says, that idea elevates me. How could it not be true? It's from Beyond Good and Evil 2:10. Now, I'm not a philosopher of the present, much less a philosopher of the future, but even I smile when Nietzsche says in so many words, the atheism arising from Christian morality or self-cruelty pleases me. It deifies me. For he says elsewhere, there's an abundant, superabundant pleasure in self-cruelty. It pleases me. How could it not be true, this atheism? Finally, what according to Nietzsche is good? Sometimes, as in Beyond Good and Evil 55, Nietzsche objects to the Christian God because he's comforting, helpful, or straightforwardly good for human life. Self-cruelty would involve denying oneself goods. Other times, however, Nietzsche objects to the Christian God because he's enervating, harmful, or bad for human life. For example, in the Antichrist, he says, we perceive what was revered as God, not as godly, but pitiful, absurd, harmful, not just as an error, but as a crime against life. The Christian God is so damaging to life, according to Nietzsche, that precisely if God were proved, he says at one point, Nietzsche would be even less able to believe in him. But if God is damaging to life, wouldn't the ladder of religious cruelty culminate in the self-loathing embrace of God? Wouldn't the ultimate self-cruelty and self-sacrifice consist in embracing a God who deprives us of any hope of bliss or future justice? This paradoxical result follows, I think, from Nietzsche's unexamined moral opinions. Utilitarianism struck Nietzsche as vulgar, base. In Beyond Good and Evil 190, he rejected out of hand the utilitarianism he attributed to Socrates in particular, on the grounds that it stinks of the rabble, to judge that it is stupid to act badly. Consistent with this is the fact that shortly before this, in Beyond Good and Evil 188, Nietzsche made the case that nature's moral imperative involves blind obedience to someone, anyone, and thus, in a certain sense, stupidity, he says. Nature's moral imperative certainly seems non-utilitarian, and in that sense, noble, at least at first glance. On closer inspection, however, it turns out that nature's moral imperative is hypothetical, not categorical. Nietzsche says as much. Thou shalt obey someone, anyone, Nietzsche says, for a further reason, not simply because you want to obey, but for a further reason. Namely, because otherwise you will perish and lose all self-respect. Now, to say nothing of the striking fact that Nietzsche speaks of perishing and loss of self-respect in one and the same breath, those things seem different. Doesn't this mean that nature's moral imperative is utilitarian, after all? Isn't Nietzsche himself doing what he complains that philosophers of the past have always done, namely seeking a foundation for morality? Doesn't he think he found one? If you obey, not categorically, but only hypothetically, if you obey, to be exact, only so as to avoid perishing and losing all self-respect, you're not really obedient to anyone at all, much less sacrificing anything of your own. To the contrary, you're obeying, in that case, only because it's smart to obey and stupid to disobey, since obedience will save and disobedience will destroy both your life and your self-respect. Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil 191, shortly after this, that Socrates saw through the irrational element in moral judgments, but Plato couldn't bring himself to accept this. But one could wonder whether Nietzsche himself saw through the irrational element in moral judgment, since he seems to think that obedience to this moral imperative of nature is rational in the end. To conclude, I wonder whether Nietzsche failed to realize that he'd suffered shipwreck because a relic of Christian morality occupied a big place in his heart, and because instead of examining it, he let his head be guided by his heart. In this too, Nietzsche was Nietzsche was, I think, closer to Pascal, representative of genuine and original Christianity, whose soul, according to Nietzsche, tested the limits of what it could do more than any other, and closer to Jesus Christ, who Nietzsche suggests in Beyond Good and Evil 49, I think, possessed the noblest soul of any human being yet. He was closer to them than to the Greeks.
I want to thank again Professor Sebell for organizing this wonderful conference, and to John Walters and Zach Bennett and Rachel Mackey for making this all work, for making this possible. My comments will be brief, so there should be plenty of time for discussion. Professor Duff's paper offers an extremely interesting and thought-provoking discussion of Heidegger's account of Nietzsche's understanding of nihilism, especially as it is touched on in the Gay Science aphorism 125. Now, since I understand little of Nietzsche but much less of Heidegger, I will just offer a few remarks on Nietzsche's account of the death of God in aphorisms 108, 125, and 343 of the Gay Science, which are the three places in which he presents the statement that God is dead. And I guess my hope is that it might shed some light on the question of nihilism that Professor Duff discusses. Now, Duff reports that according to Heidegger, Nietzsche does not mean by the death of God only the death of the Christian God, but rather, quote, the entire supersensory apparatus of the Western metaphysical tradition. To the extent that Western metaphysics depends on the Christian God, Heidegger's view makes a lot of sense to me. But at least in the Gay Science, Nietzsche does focus, at least in the first place, on the death of the Christian God. I mean, he says at the beginning of aphorism 343, the greatest recent event that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable. Now, Nietzsche stresses two key points about the death of God in the Gay Science that seem relevant to the question of nihilism. First, the decline of Christian belief is a very long-term process. The shadow of God, the influences of Christian belief, may last for thousands of years, he says in aphorism 108, because there are fundamental moral and political beliefs, for example, that all men are created equal, and even fundamental modern scientific beliefs, for example, that there are laws in nature that indirectly depend on the belief in a Christian God who creates human beings and governs and legislates for the universe. Therefore, the decline of Christian belief will, Nietzsche predicts, usher in an age. But this age may last, there may be various stages in this age, this millennia, an age of moral, political, and spiritual breakdown, destruction, ruin, and cataclysm. Secondly, Nietzsche indicates there are two responses to this decline of Christian belief. One response to this decline is to regard the world in the aftermath of the death of God as a world abandoned by God, a fallen and forsaken world, a miserable world. This is the view, I think, set forth by the madman in aphorism 125, who declares to the complacent non-believers around him, quote, "How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing?" This view may be described, I think, as nihilism, the belief that the world is nothing in the absence of God. But this view, Nietzsche suggests, however superior it might be to that of smug and shallow atheism, is still under the shadow of God, under the shadow of Christian belief. It judges the world as nothing in the light of the disappointed hope that the world is created by a loving and providential God. That is the view of the madman, who grasps the long-term consequences of the death of God more clearly than the easygoing atheists who ridicule him do, but who still views those consequences in the light of his blasted Christian beliefs and hopes. There is, however, another view of the death of God, a cheerful view of the horizon and sea of the world in the aftermath of the death of God, as Nietzsche explains in aphorism 343 of The Gay Science. This aphorism is entitled "The Meaning of Our Cheerfulness," and it begins with the remark that the greatest recent event, that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable, is already beginning to cast its first shadows over Europe. Nietzsche concludes the aphorism with the statement, quote, "Indeed, we philosophers and free minds feel when we hear the news that the old God is dead, as if a new dawn shone on us. Our heart overflows with gratitude, amazement, premonitions, expectation. At long last, the horizon appears free to us again, even if it should not be bright. At long last, our ships may venture out to face any danger. All the daring of the knower is permitted again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. Perhaps there has never yet been such an open sea." I think this view is not nihilistic, but welcomes the death of God, the decline and collapse of Christian belief, and all the moral and political scientific beliefs that depend on Christian belief as an opportunity to understand the world, even to know the world on its own terms, as it truly is, with minds undarkened by the shadow of God. This view, the view that judges the world from the perspective not of the multitude, but of the few lovers of wisdom and free minds and knowers, this non-nihilistic philosophic view is the view that Nietzsche identifies as his own. So those are my comments about Professor Duff. Now I turn to Professor Sebell. Professor Sebell's Nietzsche is an intellectually confused and psychologically troubled fellow. This Nietzsche does, quote, "not hesitate to choose nature and science over God and faith." And he even mocks those who choose faith. But his own choice for nature and science over God and faith is itself based on faith. Moreover, even though this Nietzsche does not hesitate to choose nature and science, he has grave doubts about the scientific principle of causality and doubts about the reasonability of the cultivation of reason itself, doubts that haunt him. This Nietzsche conceals from himself the devastating fact that his skepticism about reason and his questioning of the value of the will to truth may undermine his philosophic life. But he fails to recognize this catastrophic problem, this shipwreck that he has suffered. Despite quote, despite questioning the value of the will to truth, Nietzsche, this is Professor Sebell's Nietzsche, never could bring himself to give up on it entirely. At the same time, however, he said of knowledge seeking that it is insane. This Nietzsche retains his faith in reason due to self-cruelty and self-flagellation. Even though Sebell quotes Nietzsche as stating that he rejects faith as false by the criterion of truth, Sebell's Nietzsche objects to religion, quote, not because it's false. Even though Sebell's Nietzsche criticizes those who thoughtlessly, quote, retain Christian morality while jettisoning the Christian God, this Nietzsche, of course, himself retains Christianity while jettisoning the Christian God. Sebell's Nietzsche's thought is driven by unexamined moral opinions, and he dismisses such theses as Socrates' utilitarianism, it seems thoughtlessly, because it, quote, stinks. This Nietzsche, in sum, quote, let his head be guided by his heart, his Christian heart, and also perhaps by his nose. Now, if this intellectually confused, thoughtless, self-flagellating Nietzsche were the true Nietzsche, I'm not completely sure that he would be worthy of this wonderful conference that has been organized by Professor Sebell. I mean, I'm not completely sure that such a Nietzsche would be worthy of serious study. Adopting the hypothesis that Nietzsche is worthy of serious study and worthy of this wonderful conference, I suggest that one might consider a few of the elements of Nietzsche that Professor Sebell rightly pinpoints in a somewhat different light. Just briefly, no? I mean, Sebell notes that Nietzsche both champions reason and questions reason, that he both champions the will to truth and questions the value of the will to truth. Might Nietzsche not question reason, that is, raise rational questions about reason, precisely because he cannot be satisfied with incoherently embracing reason on the basis of faith? Might not Nietzsche be led precisely by the will to truth to question the value of the will to truth? Might he not question the value of the will to truth because he cannot be satisfied with a complacent, dogmatic, unexamined rationalism? Might not Nietzsche be led precisely by the will to truth to challenge what he calls, in the first chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, the prejudices of the philosophers, and also to champion the mind that is free of such prejudices, the free mind, as he puts it in the second chapter of Beyond Good and Evil? I mean, more broadly, far from being unhesitating in choosing reason over faith, might Nietzsche not be extremely cautious in choosing reason over faith precisely because of his awareness of rational doubts one may have about that choice, and also about the difficulty of freeing reason from the influence of faith? Sebell characterizes the world of faith as one in which God's purpose is sovereign, and the world of reason as one in which there are, quote, laws of nature. But in both The Gay Science and Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche suggests that the whole idea of, quote, laws of nature is itself a relic of a religious, divinized understanding of the world, a shadow of God upon modern science, because the idea of laws of nature necessarily presupposes a lawgiver of nature, a sovereign lawgiver, a God who rules the world. In this way, I think Nietzsche urges his readers, even and especially those of his readers who consider themselves supremely rational, to search their own hearts most carefully for hidden, unexamined moral and religious opinions that might darken their minds. Professor Sebell rightly draws our attention to the extremely important question of how Nietzsche grounds his choice for reason over faith. Sebell does not explicitly explain how someone might successfully ground the choice for reason, but he does hint that the great Moses Maimonides, perhaps in his critical and dialectical investigation of biblical morality in parts 2 and 3 of the Guide of the Perplexed, succeeded in grounding the choice for reason. Now, I do not know if Nietzsche studied Maimonides. In Beyond Good and Evil, aphorism 30, he does imply that he has studied the Islamic philosophers whom Maimonides admired so. I would like to close by suggesting that Nietzsche's mature writings might be understood to constitute a kind of modern version of the Guide of the Perplexed, insofar as through those writings, Nietzsche seeks to awaken in us a perplexity about many capital questions, including the question of reason and faith, and insofar as he seeks to ground the choice for reason over faith through a critical and dialectical investigation of morality, Christian and classical, slave and master. Thank you.
Sure. Well, gosh, that was wonderful. Thank you for your elegant response. I'll just kind of restate what I took from it. That Heidegger seems to set up death of God means nihilism, means collapse of highest values and the revaluation of values, that chain of reasoning. Your rereading of Nietzsche for me shows me that Heidegger's equation of the death of God with nihilism is, that for Nietzsche, that's only partial. And that Heidegger has assumed that's the whole story, or taken that to be the whole story, whereas Nietzsche has this alternative suggestion of a response to this condition. I found that very, you made it look easy, but it was a very rich suggestion, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. In my defense, I wasn't invited, as I said. So, just very quickly, I don't mean to deny Nietzsche's greatness as a thinker by any means, by drawing attention to what I see as difficulties. But that said, I think that Peter is absolutely right that Nietzsche questions the value of the will to truth on the basis of his own will to truth. And if you look at, for example, Beyond Good and Evil 1 follows immediately, of course, the preface to Beyond Good and Evil. In the preface to Beyond Good and Evil, what are we told? We're told that dogmatism is either collapsed or on the brink of collapse. And that's to say, in Nietzsche's formulation, Lady Truth has not allowed herself to be wooed thus far, it seems. And he turns directly from this claim to an exploration of the value of the will to truth in Beyond Good and Evil 1. And that makes, as I think I indicated, perfect sense. But for the reasons I gave. As for Beyond Good and Evil 1, I think Nietzsche makes precisely the point very beautifully and delicately that Peter also made beautifully and delicately, though less, a little less beautifully and delicately than our Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, the will to truth has thus far tempted us to many a venture, and finally, shouldn't we start to ask questions of the will to truth? And specifically, shouldn't we ask ourselves not just the question of what causes this will, but the deeper question, what's the value of this will to truth? And Nietzsche indicates in a few ways that the very questioning of the value of the will to truth is an expression of his own will to truth. 2 ways, or 3 ways, I suppose, that I can remember. He says at the beginning of that aphorism, the will to truth will still tempt us to many a venture. Still, even after questioning its value, it will continue to tempt us. And he says that there are many risks involved in abiding or adhering to the will to truth, that many dangers are involved. And he says at the very end of that aphorism that there's a risk or a danger involved in questioning the value of the will to truth, which I think suggests that the will to truth is still operating in him. Finally, and maybe most importantly, that aphorism is very complicated by the fact that at a certain point Nietzsche raises the question, well, who's asking the question here? And that shows his, who's the Sphinx, who's the Oedipus, and that's to bring home precisely this point, that in the very asking of the question of the value of the will to truth, isn't the will to truth that's going to be giving the answers? Or isn't it truth that's going to be giving the answers, and don't you therefore still value truth? Now, I think, that being said, Nietzsche has a kind of self-critical attitude to the will to truth on the one hand, but on the other hand, like I said, it emerges right away. Again, the will to truth survives the self-critical examination that you see it's subjected to in Beyond Good and Evil 1. Nietzsche, and I'll say two things about the difficulty involved in that. First, Nietzsche doesn't, I think, there or elsewhere, especially at the end of Genealogy of Morals Part 3, where this question is taken up at the greatest length, Nietzsche doesn't seem to be deeply aware of the possibility that truth and the will to truth might not be a thing known and accessible to reason. He doesn't raise the question that he says Pilate raised in Jesus' presence, what is truth? It might be the case, in other words, that the truth is accessible by faith. And Nietzsche seems to think of it only in terms of something that emerges to the eye of reason. And you can see that also, I think, in this. Nietzsche never seemed to see or admit that his skepticism about the value of truth and the possibility of obtaining it opened the door to faith, which is just another way of saying what I said a moment ago. Maimonides, when he praises Aristotle in Part 2, Chapter 19 of the Guide, in this remark I read, he praises Aristotle because Aristotle, he says, as much as he wished to have a rational solution to this problem, the problem of the first cause of the whole, he didn't conceal from himself the fact that he didn't have one. And that's to say, he opened himself up to the great problem that arises from that. And Nietzsche seems to not have opened himself up to that problem, the problem that emerges from questioning the possibility and value of truth. So I'll leave it at that.
Obviously, this is a big question, and we need to have the audience. But I would just say, it does seem to me, for what it's worth, that he does face this question, and it seems, I actually think he may allude to this question about the possible truth of faith in aphorism 37 of Beyond Good and Evil, where after giving this seemingly scientific account of will to power, about how you can explain everything through will to power, he raises the question, does this mean that God is refuted? And he says no. And I wonder, again, this is all tentative, but I wonder if he thereafter undertakes the investigation of religion, and specifically the investigation of the morality, of Christian morality at the end of Free Spirits of Chapter 2, and then above all in Chapter 3, as a way of addressing the possible question of the truth, say, of Christianity, but through a moral investigation of its morality rather than through a scientific investigation. Again, I mean, that's just a sort of possible suggestion.
Yeah. But I think I read 37 differently. Remember, at the end of 37, he says, well, doesn't that mean that God is refuted and the devil is not? Popularly speaking, but then he says, no, and by the way, who forces you to speak popularly or vulgarly? Which is to say, I think that he denies the popular distinction between God and devil at all, that it wouldn't be appropriate to say that the will to power, as hypothetically defended in 36, is in fact a justification of God. That would be to maintain the way of speaking common to the people. And I think this is borne out by Beyond Good and Evil, I think it's 191. There, Nietzsche denies that the age-old question of faith and reason is really properly understood as a question between faith and reason. He says it's between reason and instinct. He reduces faith to instinct. And I think that flies in the face of his very clear formulation of the opposition between faith and reason that I tried to outline, that you find in the Antichrist. I think he obscures the question rather than facing it as it emerges in ordinary life. And that brings me to what you said about morality. I personally don't see anywhere in Nietzsche a critique of morality. One sign of this is that, yes, Nietzsche says at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil and Beyond Good and Evil 2 that the philosophers thus far have faith in opposites and faith in opposite values specifically. And he seems to suggest that he doesn't. I mean, that's open to serious objections. I mean, you can't even refer to a world without opposites without the implicit suggestion that that's to be opposed to a world with opposites. But in any event, Nietzsche makes this claim about denying faith in opposite values. And then he goes on in Beyond Good and Evil 5, for example, to speak of the virtue of courage. And he suggests that Spinoza lacked the courage of conscience to admit to himself the truth that he was merely engaging in memoir writing when he thought he was doing philosophy. But I don't see anywhere in Nietzsche an examination of what courage is. He does blame people for being cowardly, and he praises people for being courageous. But when you get to Beyond Good and Evil 23, and Nietzsche says we've got to sail right over morality, we've got to destroy the remnants of our own morality in the process. But there's been no examination of morality prior to that.
But Dustin, I mean, the book has an order, I mean, he says what you say he says in aphorism 23, but, part 5 is on morality. Part 9 raises the question, what is noble? And that is clearly, I think, a question that is, there are 3 answers given to that question or explored in chapter 29. First, the aristocratic morality, master morality, but then all of a sudden, profound suffering makes noble. And then he gives the example of Christians. So that's a different possible answer to that question. And then at the end, somehow, philosophy emerges as a possible answer to the question. So I think it just seems to me that there is, that there's a kind of thought process he leads us through, and whether or not it's an adequate one, that one has to take more seriously, perhaps that structure, that line of thinking.
But I mean, to begin with, you can't say it's odd to say at the end of part 1 we're overcoming a morality and then preserving the critique of morality to the end. Now that's not an impossibility. So that's a minor point. But I think the major point that I would make is this. He's odd. We agree about that. Yes, for sure. But the more important point I would make is. Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil 2:20 raises the question of whether human beings act interestedly alone or also disinterestedly. And he denies that anyone acts disinterestedly. And he, rather than develop a proof of that point, he simply scoffs at people who raise objections. Someone says, what about love? Isn't love selfless? And then someone says, what about the praise that we lavish upon those who engage in self-sacrifice? And Nietzsche just scoffs at them and then concludes that aphorism by saying truth has to stifle her yawns when she's exposed to such questions. Now, I think such questions, not put in that way, but such questions are at the forefront of, for example, Socrates' search for truth. But Nietzsche seems to think that they're boring, maybe in the same way he thought that Plato was boring. And this is a real problem for Nietzsche because despite saying in 220 that human beings are fundamentally self-interested. He said in Beyond Good and Evil 51, just to give one of many possible examples, he said in Beyond Good and Evil 51 that what made the powerful of the world, that is the nobles, stop before the saint and start to question themselves. So he is engaging with this very big question of how on earth the nobles, if they're so good, ever succumbed to the corruption of the slaves. And he says what made them stop before the saint was that they wondered whether he wasn't aware through secret visitors, that is through revelation, of certain dangers to which they were all exposed. And so that means that what the powerful of the world saw in the saint was the possibility that they might be themselves exposed to danger. So they were self-interested. And therefore, are they noble anymore? Based on what you said, I'm not so sure. So, yeah.
I mean, again, yeah. I mean, I think part of our disagreement may be partly about the question of Nietzsche as a writer. I mean, I'd be inclined to see Nietzsche as a writer in the way that Plato is a writer, that you have to, look at the book, the stages of the discussion. I don't mean to claim I understand that, but it seems to me that that at least has to be taken into account rather than, just, yeah.
Yeah,
maybe stressed more.
Nobody should accept my conclusions without carefully studying the book and taking it at face value.
But again, I mean, yeah, as a structure and so forth. But anyway.
Shall we do some Q&A? We have plenty of time for Q&A this time.
I have a question for Professor Duff about Heidegger criticism of Nietzsche and how, I guess the question I have is, did Heidegger see Nietzsche as just a long line of failures in Western philosophy and it's leading up to nihilism just from Plato himself, or did he see something different in Nietzsche that might have led to something else, like Heidegger being able to look beyond just beings and think about the being itself?
Yeah. The long line of failures remark, Heidegger always exempts the thinkers themselves from a kind of castigation for getting it wrong or making errors in their thought, which sometimes feels like a juxtaposition to his sometimes catastrophic account of what's going on through Western philosophy. But this comes out more in some of this later work, but he suggests that being itself has withdrawn, and that it has withdrawn by leaving itself as though the meaning of being is to be something. And that each thinker who has worked out for themselves some comprehensive account of that has been, as it were, playing without a full deck. They've been trying to think things through when being has withdrawn and concealed that it's withdrawn. So from the pre-Socratics, let alone Plato, through to Nietzsche, the metaphysical trajectory of the West has been premised on an error, and it's not really the fault, so to speak, of any of the thinkers involved. But yes, he does conclude that this trajectory has reached a kind of terminus in Nietzsche, and that a little bit in the manner of the New Seas passage that you directed us to, Dr. Arnsdorf. A little bit in the spirit of that, he does. I always like to emphasize this about Heidegger. He sees a kind of hopefulness in what is now available to us, given that the era of metaphysics has been shown to be concluded or brought to a conclusion. And when I say hopefulness, I need to immediately stress the phenomena of nihilism that he thinks manifest this hopefulness are horrible. He really thinks that the Holocaust, the division of Germany, the First and the Second World War, life under technology, the atomic present, these are the phenomena that he thinks a kind of withdrawal from them, but should permit us to be hopeful for something different. I find that rather chilling. And by trying to give him his due, I don't mean to mislead anyone. I think that might be an adequate response for now.
All right, I'd like to ask a question to each of you, but I'll limit myself to Alex Duff first. Do you think that Heidegger's not paying attention to the published writings has perhaps distorted his focus in Nietzsche? For the focus on the will to power, of course, but especially in connection with the idea of value. For I'll just mention that in Gay Science number 346, Nietzsche questions the notion of value itself and questions the notion that man is the measure of value, or that we can in fact determine the value of the world. And that's also a point he develops in The Twilight of the Idols, that we must recognize this finesse, that we are in no position to determine the value of existence. Now, that doesn't mean that he then, at least from his point of view, is left with nothing or complete nihilism. It means rather we have to take a stance toward the world which is not based on the idea of value. So he seems to have not seen these discussions in Nietzsche. I mean, do you think this is a...
That's a very powerful suggestion, one which, yeah, I think you're probably right. I could not myself assess the Nietzsche corpus and what Heidegger's, as you know, years-long involvement in preparing its production. Something that Mr. Grenke said the other day brought me up short when he suggested that the will to power, this publication was greatly greatly abused in its being assembled. That almost cuts to the heart of Nietzsche's readings. We're then left with the very strange fact that this is a very, very powerful reading, and yet it seems to be premised on some philologically Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche, if I misspoke. Yeah,
He's reading his sister's Nietzsche.
yeah.
I mean,
I don't know the ins and outs of
Nietzsche's sisters.
of the publication the way that one should, but I think that would be that's very likely. And I would then wonder if something of the ascent among, let's say, a certain academic circles, well represented here over the last 50 years or so, of reading Nietzsche much more dialectically in the manner that Dr. Arnstorff was suggesting, suggestively, ironically, if that isn't a very welcome correction of this tendency of Heidegger's. And again, I appreciate your directing me to some places in Nietzsche where he anticipates some of this critique in a way that Heidegger doesn't seem to allow, especially in the texts that I've been working from.
Dr. Schall, Dr. Zuckert, I think, had.
This may be sending this off track, but I'm going to react to the title of this panel, which was Nietzsche's Critique of Religion. And it seems to me that Christianity isn't the only religion, and that Nietzsche didn't think it was the only religion. And so I wondered what the three members of the panel thought about the fact that Nietzsche opposes the crucified in his own name as Dionysus. The end of Beyond Good and Evil is with the genius of the heart, who is identified there with Dionysus. And Dionysus is a god. So Nietzsche seems to be looking towards something divine. And likewise, as I think almost everybody who's heard of Heidegger knows, he, at the end of his life, famously said, "Only a God can save us." And there are more complicated allusions to, in the fourfold that the horizon of the world is defended by gods. So I guess I found the simple identification of Nietzsche with values or Nietzsche with reason to be a little partial.
Why don't you take it?
I didn't write the panel titles either.
Yes, he did.
Zach's, goodbye, Zach. So I think it's certainly true that religion is a broader category than just Christianity. Nietzsche has a lot to say, not just about Christianity, but also about, of course, Judaism and even Buddhism, and you know, the Vedanta philosophy / religion of the Indians. So the focus, though, on Christianity, I think, is ultimately justified by two considerations, which I mentioned in passing at the end. One is that Nietzsche seems to think that when he begins part 3 of Beyond Good and Evil, he raises the question of the full extent of the soul's powers, and how those powers have been actualized thus far. And he suggests that the fullest extent of the soul's power has been actualized thus far by Pascal, in whom the problem of science and conscience lived most fully. And so immediately he turns from the general question of the human soul and its limits to the specific case of Pascal, the representative of original Christianity. And similarly, in 49, he suggests, as I said, that I think Jesus flew higher than any human being thus far, despite all the bad things he has to say about Christianity and Jesus elsewhere. The question, what is religion for Nietzsche, is hard to answer, because I don't think Nietzsche gives a clear answer. There's an illuminating passage where he quotes from Renan in part 3 of Beyond Good and Evil, and he describes that passage as the religious neuroses par excellence, which seems to suggest that he might think that is kind of essential to religion in certain crucial ways. That might be among the places where he gets closest to try to identify the essence of religion, but he there speaks clearly. I mean, Renan is speaking of Christianity, and Nietzsche speaks of the way in which Renan speaks of the way in which Christians are closest to the truth when they are good, and when they deplore death, and when they are virtuous. So Nietzsche's another place where Nietzsche addresses the question of what religion is broadly is in the Genealogy of Morals, where he suggests that the Greeks worshipped gods because they needed witnesses for their actions. He says that human suffering isn't the problem is that human suffering lacks meaning. People speak of the meaning of life to this day, unfortunately, partly because of Nietzsche. It's a very vague thing to say. But there, Nietzsche suggests that religion could be not, as Renan described it, as promising immortality and reward for virtue, but rather just doing noble deeds, suffering on account of them, and doing so gladly in the belief that those noble deeds are just being witnessed. I think that's not an adequate account of suffering or the kind of redemption of suffering that human beings look for. I mean, if you're being tortured cruelly, your situation is not going to be vastly improved by the fact that you're on camera. So I don't think there's a clear answer in Nietzsche as to the question, what is religion? And he even seems to deny in places, in part 3, that there's one thing that defines religion. He speaks of the passion for God, and at one point in one aphorism, I forget which, early on, and then outlines various possibilities for what that could mean, which are all very different from one another. So,
just a couple points. The response, Professor Zuckert, with Dionysus, I mean, it is sort of a paradox, no? Because on the one hand, it's Dionysus versus the crucified, so it's a god. But on the other hand, Dionysus is a philosopher. Nietzsche is a disciple of Dionysus. So it's a sort of ambiguous. What is Dionysus? A god is Dionysus, a representative of philosophy, reason. With regard to religion, one example I think that's of interest regarding his discussion of non-Christian religion is precisely the Greek gods that he talks about. And on the one hand, there's this wonderful appreciation, I think, of the Greek gods as a kind of reflection and divination of humanity, and therefore as sort of you have eros, you have anger, war, and the effect of that religion is to sort of affirm the dignity and value of humanity, especially in contrast with Christianity, which all these things are sins and so forth. On the other hand, I think, he doesn't emphasize this so much, but I think he makes clear that, that the Greek gods, Greek religion only appeal to an aspect of humanity, to those human beings who are strong, proud, confident, those he sometimes refers to provocatively as masters. But not only those particular human beings, but precisely to those human beings when they feel proud, confident, and so forth. But as he acknowledges, sometimes somewhat acerbically, human beings are also suffering beings and fearful beings. And that's true of all human beings, including ones, even Achilles, even Odysseus. And so he says, Christianity offered hope. It offered comfort, in a way that the pagan religion didn't. And so there is a kind of, it's just an interesting contrast because it shows a certain balance in some respects about the psychology of religion, or how religions appeal to different things that might be pertinent.
I would maybe just add that I share your suspicion that Heidegger is being reductive in treating Nietzsche as simply a metaphysician of value. In the book that essay is contained in, Holzwege, the subsequent essay to the one on Nietzsche is called What Are Poets For? And I think the answer to Heidegger on the issue of the gods is that the poets are, one of the things poets do is they bring forth the gods. So that would be his expectation that we are in an epoch where that is possible in a way that it has not been since technology was the dominant force of bringing forth as setting upon. Something like this, I think, is where you'd have to look.
Professor Schell, I think, had a... Okay, I don't want to interrupt.
Just since we haven't gotten a lot of student questions, if that's okay.
This is a question for Professor Sebell, kind of building off something that Professor Ahrensdorf was speaking of. This question is a bit confused in my mind, so we'll see if I can get it out there. There's a passage in Kant that's been on my mind where he says something like, to even accept the Holy One as the Holy One, you'd have to compare him with the moral ideal of perfection or something like this. So it seems to me, in some way, that always strikes me as somewhat Socratic in a certain way. Kind of beliefs in gods coming out of these moral opinions that we have. So I wonder about the genealogical approach that Nietzsche takes in the genealogy of morals. If he can show that this ideal of moral perfection, how this ideal of moral perfection kind of came about, does that not provide adequate grounds to maybe not take that certain revelation seriously? It may not preclude him from being able to deny all revelation, but it seems that are there adequate grounds there to reject the Christian God?
Yeah, I think I see why you would suggest that it's a sort of Socratic move, but I actually think it's an unsocratic move. In Dawn 91, Nietzsche engages in a kind of natural theology, and he does this, by the way, in the Antichrist repeatedly. The passage I read, we wouldn't accept God. He's not godly, if he's not godly, even if he existed, if that makes any sense. But in Dawn 91, Nietzsche works through the ways in which God seems not to live up to our moral standards. Specifically, his attention there is focused on God's hidden character. If God was truthful, shouldn't he make himself perfectly clear to us? So is he unwilling or is he unable to be good, that is, truthful? I think the obvious difficulty with this sort of line of thought with natural theology broadly as a response to the question of the gods is that it depends on an assumption or a premise which isn't shared by all parties to the controversy, namely that God conforms to our ideas. In the Euthyphro, I've sort of suggested that there's no laches in Nietzsche, and I sort of suggested just a moment ago there's no Euthyphro in Nietzsche, no equivalent of these things in Nietzsche. But in the Euthyphro, the question arises, of course, is the pious pious because it's pious, or is it pious because God loves it? Sorry, is the pious loved by gods because it's pious? Or is it pious because gods love it? And Euthyphro is unwilling to simply accept the Socrates' efforts to subordinate the gods to the ideas, and specifically to the idea of justice. Something in him revolts against that. Something in him is very open to the view that one is required to obey the gods. I wouldn't say simply blindly, but in hope and in faith, if in some measure of ignorance of the moral character of what it is they're asking you to do. And I think that for Socrates is a very serious position, and one that probably bears out the religious outlook most fully and isn't addressed fairly by natural theology, which would subordinate God right from the outset to reason.
But what then would be an alternative to natural theology?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I mean, I would say to begin with that there might not be an alternative, in which case, we're in a pickle. You mentioned Socrates, so I'd just say Socrates never really asked anyone questions about the divine attributes. And in fact, when Euthyphro tries to tell him the stories about the gods that he claims to know to be true, Socrates says, don't worry about it. He's not interested in what Euthyphro has to say about the nature of the gods. Instead, Socrates seems, just gathering this from the dialogues most broadly, Socrates seems just interested in people's moral opinions. Now, how that inquiry into people's moral opinions bears on the gods is not obvious, but I would say it is obvious that it's not in the direct way that you suggest.
But the genealogical account of the way our morals come to be, from a non-natural theological position, it seems that if he can account for the way our moral hopes have been shaped, then it seems that it would be very similar to Socrates, seeing how these belief in God stem from our moral opinions, and these moral opinions are confused, so therefore I don't have to necessarily accept this revelation that you claim to have. So in that way, does it seem Socratic? And I wonder if it's this very genealogical approach, kind of his historicism in the end, that would preclude him from having adequate justification?
Well, in Dawn 95, which, by the way, Strauss links Dawn 91 and Dawn 95. In Dawn 95, Nietzsche says historical refutation of God as the definitive refutation. And he suggests that precisely what you say, if we were to account for the emergence of God, the coming into being of belief in God, I should say, one will have refuted God more fully than if one had delivered a direct refutation of God's existence. I don't think that necessarily works very well. I mean, you would have to spell it exactly the steps, first of all. But bracketing that very big question, it's the case when it comes to all natural or so-called natural phenomena that one might give a sort of debunking account of the phenomena. And it might be the case that human beings evolved from non-human beings from the point of view of a naturalistic framework. But there's nothing preventing what seems to have happened naturally from, in fact, happening supernaturally, given the limits on our knowledge, which Nietzsche fully acknowledges, at least at times. So I'm skeptical.
Is this a good time? I know you wanted to.
I think we only need let's say 5 minutes at the end for Dick.
Okay, all right,
Yeah.
fine. Some more questions here?
I don't want to intrude on students.
We'll take Susan next after.
I'm a student of Nietzsche, so. This is a question to Dustin. Does Nietzsche ever consider Christian cosmology, morality, and even the church as beneficial on his own terms? In other words, as a catalyst and supporter of higher culture and its creative geniuses?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so this conjures some of what Jeff was talking about yesterday. So for example, as generative of the literature, art, and architecture of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, even the Romantic period. And you can even say Hinduism and Buddhism are part of this, generate these kinds of things. People go on vacations and they go see, Hindu and Buddhist buildings. And even as a corrective to the decadence of the bourgeois and the demos. So I'm not that familiar, but it seems that there's a tension in his work. He believes that religion is a lie, perhaps, but it on his own terms, it's very beneficial. So he has to choose, perhaps.
Yeah. No, he certainly is not simply and wholly a critic of Christianity. I think Michael Granke mentioned on, what was it, Wednesday night, that the ways in which, in a way, the very existence of human beings as they are, with the consciences that they have, is owing to the deepening that took place when slave morality, as Nietzsche called it, developed. That there's a deepening that occurred, to which we are owing to Christianity, to which we should be somewhat grateful to Christianity, I think. And certainly Nietzsche thinks that high culture, I think this comes across also in Beyond Good and Evil 188, that it's precisely the tension and the imposition imposed on us by Christianity, the discipline imposed upon us, that created for so many years such an impressive and high culture during the periods you mentioned. And also he says, this is in Beyond Good and Evil Part 3, I forget which aphorism again, Nietzsche says that we're to be grateful to Christianity for the fact that it's provided human beings who would otherwise despair of life the greatest comfort that anything, 61, the greatest comfort that they've ever had the benefit of. But so Nietzsche is certainly appreciative of Christianity's contributions. His sense that the contributions go hand in hand with injury and injuries has to be considered, though. Yeah.
Thank you for really these very rich papers. I want to ask a question or raise an issue that Alex raised, which may also recall something that Richard said. And that's just to put this funny term value on the table, because it occurs to me on the one hand that it is a peculiarly modern term, or at least there may be another way of putting it, but it's not a term you hear very much in the Greeks. And it's also a particular bugaboo of Heidegger, obviously, who seems to associate value thinking with the notion of truth as adequation and all those bad things that entails. Obviously, value is a big deal for Nietzsche. It's a term that he uses a lot. So I wanted to just sort of wonder, for all of you, what you take Nietzsche to mean by value. And what I have in mind is also, these are just sort of random thoughts, but I'm really interested to know what you think he means. But it's partly also with a view to a discussion from yesterday having to do with the eternal return and the difference between resignation, the giving up of false hope, versus affirmation or celebration. And I just wanted to put another possibility on the table, which might bring in the idea of value without recurring to truth as adequation. And that would be, and again, this is extremely tentative, but this term gratitude, which Nietzsche also uses. Because gratitude, of course, has many possible meanings. But one, and it reminds you of Christian grace and so on and so forth, but one meaning it might have and obviously also it's a big term for Heidegger, but, Danke and Denke, and so on. But it also might have something to do with a kind of overflowing return that does not expect to get something back, which is in a way one way of understanding gratitude. In other words, that this would be will to truth as will to power as a kind of overflowing, which would reflect the abundance of life without recurring to this kind of, truth as adequation economy of parsimony that Nietzsche seems to want to get beyond. So I just sort of throw this out. Again, these are all metaphorical terms. I don't mean to insist too strongly on any of them, but to elicit from you some further reflections on what you take Nietzsche to mean by value.
You're a Nietzsche scholar.
The simple answer is I'm not sure what a value is, and I'm not sure what a value is in Nietzsche. One difficulty is that does value refer to, I think Strauss puts it this way, does value refer to the principles of preference or to the preferences themselves? I'm never sure. Maybe another related difficulty that goes hand in hand with that one is Nietzsche speaks of values as being created by human beings, and he speaks of philosophers as having the responsibility to create values. I have difficulty understanding how that could be possible. I understand that it might be the case that values, let's say moral principles, might be the result of human art, let's say, or imagination. But what I don't understand is how those values could be seen as binding by human beings when they're viewed as creations of human beings. Maimonides says, belief is not the notion that is uttered, but the notion represented in the soul when it is averred of it, that it is in fact just as it has been represented in the soul. That's to say, I think that if you were to posit a value, you're saying that it really exists. But if you're aware of yourself as positing the value, then you're aware that it doesn't exist. And I've never been able to understand how you can thread that needle. So I don't have much to offer along those lines to that part of your question. I suppose to what you say about a kind of overflowing, which asks for nothing back. Gratitude is a kind of overflowing that asks for nothing back. Nietzsche at times speaks as if human beings have such a capacity in them. Other times he denies that they have such a capacity in them. I think I mentioned some, but I think it's in Twilight of the Idle Skirmishes 20, he says Schopenhauer was all wrong for thinking that Eros is disinterested. It's deeply interested, Nietzsche says. And this goes hand in hand, of course, with Beyond Good and Evil 20, where he suggests that we're all interested and incapable of disinterested action. So sometimes Nietzsche suggests, yes, there's a kind of overflowing self-sacrifice. Other times he suggests we're
not self-sacrifice. It's one of this kind of gratitude I'm talking about is not self-sacrifice.
But you ask for nothing back.
That's right. It's an overflowing that, it's not disinterested because there's this pleasure, this Machtgefühl that accompanies it. It's not at all disinterested.
Yeah.
It's highly interested, but precisely without kind of
Right. Yeah. Okay. So in that case, the will to power tends in various statements about the will to power tend in that direction. It always reminds me of this Baudelaire poem about a moth that flies into a flame and says it's just delighted, and then it burns up. And there's a kind of more expansive idea of what our self-interest might consist in Nietzsche, which includes, it seems, destroying ourselves.
Remaking ourselves.
Well, but you might perish.
Well, yeah.
I think it does consist in destroying self. And Nietzsche says in Genealogy of Morals, I think this is in part 2, again, I'm not remembering exactly where, but he says that the will to power we're not driven by a will to happiness. We're driven by the will to power, and the will to power might even lead us to deviate from the path that would bring us to happiness. So there's a kind of a transcendent good, almost transcendent good, that is represented by the name will to power, it seems. How you understand that, I don't know. I don't know why Nietzsche, sometimes I wonder, why doesn't Nietzsche say that's a will to the nothing and a will to death, which he often...
Beyond this I, you're still clinging to the avenue.
Well, you must have a feeling. You must have you must have a feeling of pleasure. The moth must have a feeling of pleasure that it's so good
Beyond
that it...
yourself, you're a new self.
Well, then we're talking immortality of some kind. Well, this is why I don't understand it, in short. Yeah.
If you wanted to take that
Oh.
last question, I think that this is the time to do it.
Yeah, so I'm going to channel Dick Zinman as best I can. I should have grown a mustache in advance, but I only had 8 months warning, and I'd need 10, 20 years. This is a question for Michael Granke. Dick would like you to elaborate on something you said in your lecture and again in a comment, namely, Nietzsche thought, or at least may have thought, that the Socratics had too limited an understanding of the possibilities of man. So I think that's what he's saying you said. And Dick, this is the shortest question I've ever heard Dick ask, and it might be because I'm the one asking it, I don't know. But his question is, what does this mean? What possibilities did the Socratics neglect?
Oh, okay. So I refer to the standard of the eternal return as possibly being the basis of the ultimately negative judgment about Socrates and Plato that regards, as Nietzsche says, Plato and Socrates as examples of decay.
Right.
And maybe I'll just say it a little more fully here. What Susan was just talking about, this notion of acting out of fullness, which I think you obtusely reject, which is, this is missing from the Socratic psychology, which understands human nature as a list of defects and needs and lacks. There's a passage in the Republic where Socrates actually considers the condition of a sick person who might think that health is nothing other than the end of their sickness or the filling up of their defects. And then he makes a strange comparison between human beings who've only experienced darkness and then think that some kind of grayness would be the light. And they don't reach to what would really be the light. That's what I have in mind. This is, I think, what Nietzsche does point to as a defect in the Socratic understanding and the Socratic condition, that they ignore what health would mean if a human being had all of their needs fulfilled. And then what would they do? But that's what I think, I talked about a little bit. The will to power would tell you living beings would still be active, even without the need for external objects that would fulfill something they lack themselves. They would still want to do things. That's what's missing. Celebration, joy, full life. So that's my answer to Dick, and I'm glad I haven't talked with him in a couple decades.
Right, I think we'll let that be the last word for now. We will reconvene at 3 for the concluding lecture, which will be delivered by Heinrich Meyer. So we hope to see you in a couple hours. Please thank our panelists.